This is my snapshot number 2 reflection, and I've decided to do the first question, considering the debates around CSL and higher education and your work in the field. How does what you are doing in CSL and with your placement fit or not with your academic, personal, and or professional learning program and goals? Does your experience match or challenge the debates surrounding CSL and higher education? There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get started. So when I think about my educational goals, I think about how, like most people, I don't just want to stop at academics. Obviously, my educational goals include to get a university degree, but beyond that, I want to keep learning for the rest of my life every day, always be asking questions so that I'm consistently growing. I think that CSL supports these goals because of the meaningful reflection that it requires, for example, these assignments, and the discussions that we do in class. Beyond that, I want to seek diverse experiential learning opportunities, which is something that I feel that CSL is giving me. Through my CSL placement, I get to participate in some of these experiential learning opportunities. For example, going to the meetings of the Accessibility Advisory Committee and talking to people who are part of the group which they target. That's something that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do outside of CSL. And it creates this atmosphere that's welcoming for the anti-foundational learning that Boutin talks about in his textbook. Anti-foundational learning is something that fits well with CSL because when the student is in that community and experiencing the atmosphere and experiencing working with the community with which they're partnered, the learning outcomes can't be controlled, and they'll just be whatever truth that a student ends up taking out of it. Beyond that, I want to open myself up to experience the cycle described in Dunlap's The Invisible Knapsack, with the trigger event, the grappling, to come to further understand my own privilege and what I can do about it. One of my favorite things about CSL in an academic context is that it's so different from every other class, because sometimes in other classes, I feel like the assignments are pointless beyond the academic context. We're writing these long essays and spending hours working on assignments just to get a grade, and they'll never be useful beyond that. But in CSL, the experience and the work is real and it's practical, and it exists in the real world. This connects to Boutin's article, The Limits of Service Learning, because in that article, Boutin describes CSL as catering to a more soft and applied academic curriculum. Soft in that there aren't hardcore rules like math or physics. Instead, it's just kind of open-ended questions and open-ended theses that end up coming out of it. However, what's important to me is that it's applied, which means it's not just theoretical, it's not just on paper. It actually exists in the real world. In Morton's article about charity, project, and social change, Morton addresses the ways that community service learning can be applied in the real world. And Morton kind of implies that charity is kind of the lower end of the spectrum. It's always short term and it's always less impactful than the social change. The truth is that sometimes CSL placements are really just charity projects, but I don't think this is always necessarily a bad thing. For example, we are doing what I would call a charity project with the Accessibility Advisory Committee right now. What that means is that as a group, Michelle, Luke, and Brandy and I are doing a charity service to sort through all this literature about how to make public events accessible and compiling them into a manual and a checklist for Edmonton-specific event planners to use. This is, I think, a charity. I wouldn't call it a project because it's not really extended long term, and I don't really think it's much of a social change. However, this is a useful resource that the Accessibility Advisory Committee has asked for, that the City of Edmonton will use in the future, and so I think it will help in the long term, community service learning projects should continue to be careful and honest about what their project is, but I don't think that being on the lower end, that charity end of the spectrum, is always necessarily a bad thing. My professional goals include going into politics in the long term and public service. CSL does definitely fit with these goals because it allows me to make connections and network and also get experience in different jobs and different groups and communities that I might not have otherwise interacted with. So in these ways, CSL learning and my CSL placements that I've experienced do fit with my educational and professional goals. But this brings to mind, once again, Dunlap's Invisible Knapsack article about privilege, because I know that I do have a lot of privilege as I'm going into these new communities, and I need to be aware of that, and I need to be constantly mindful and thinking critically, especially about who is the service learning intended for, which Dunlap mentions is service learning really just about providing a solid educational experience for that university student who is already privileged, or is the service learning project actually helping the community it goes into? I feel that the placement I'm doing right now is helping. In conclusion, I feel that my experience with CSL and at my placement does fit with my personal, professional, and educational goals. And I do recognize the debates surrounding CSL. I feel that I have witnessed some parts of them in my experience with community service learning, but I feel that there are ways around it. So community service learning, even the arguments against it, aren't necessarily bad. Just the program creators need to be mindful of that, and the students as well, like me, need to be mindful of how we're approaching these learning opportunities.